just disappeared there for a minute, so I thought I might have to wing it for a minute. David's got extensive experience in the fields of employment relations, industrial relations, has a national and international reputation in that, and he's done some work in terms of collecting data, which hopefully some of you have contributed to, looking at the impact of working from home during COVID-19, which he'd like to share with us today. David said he'll talk for around about 40 minutes or so. At this stage, it'd probably be good if you just kept any questions to points of clarification. So if there's something you don't understand, David's only too happy to explain it to you, but let's keep the discussion for the end. I think there'll be around about 20 minutes for discussion. If I can ask you all to sort of mute microphones and sort of turn off videos and so on, because I think David will probably be using the presentation thing and we don't want to suck up resources. Okay, without further ado, thanks very much, David. Over to you.
Thank you, Peter. And I shall now demonstrate my high-tech skills by shifting over to the presentation, and let's hoping that it works. So hopefully you're all seeing the title screen. Will somebody tell me if that's what you're seeing?
Looking good.
Okay. So, yeah, so as Peter said, we're looking at the effects of working from home under COVID on university staff, and it's quite a big project. In fact, the project team has this list of people in it. There's about 28 of us, but decided that it wouldn't really be good for 28 people to be talking at once. And some of the people are here. I saw Sheila's name earlier, and I think that maybe Tim and Shailene and Iona might be here. Maybe some others, I'm not certain. So the names are listed here. We just got a couple of Griffith colleagues at the front, Joanna Westar, who then was really the main coordinator across the Canadian half of the study, and then the rest are in alphabetical order by first name, because that was actually the easiest way I could get Word to sort it. So how did the project start? It started with a tweet, believe it or not, like many good academic projects these days. A tweet from a woman who was an editor of the British Journal for the Philosophy of Science. And she made this comment in April about the negligible number of submissions to the journal from women in the last month. Never seen anything like it. And as soon as I saw that, I thought, yeah, wow, that's really going to have a big impact on women in universities. In the first instance, I was thinking about my own university and what this meant for things like performance appraisal and promotions and stuff. I did a bit more reading and found this article in Nature about the pandemic and the female academic. And this article in the Annals of the Florida Academic Mums. And if you read through the abstract, you'll get an idea as to what it's about. I'm not going to read it all out. But the long and the short of it was that, yes, there's an issue here. We need to better understand it and we need to do something about it. So I emailed the Vice-Chancellor, as one does, and said, we need to do something about this and to understand more about it, do a bit of research maybe in Griffith. And she said, oh, yeah, that sounds okay, but I don't really want it to just be about Griffith. And in the time it took between when I'd pressed send and when I read her reply, I was starting to think, yeah, it would really be good for it just to be Griffith. So we then went about approaching some other colleagues and a number of universities. I was hoping we'd get 3 other universities involved, 2 or 3. We've ended up with 14 in the project. So that's pretty good. And it's an online study. So we go through the sample or population really in each case is employees on each of the 14 universities that are involved in it. An email is basically sent out to all of them with various reminders saying this is really important, and when people go to look at the link, this is basically what they come across. So we've had about 11,000 observations, or a bit over 11,000 observations, half in Australia and half in Canada. And most of what I'm going to be talking about here comprises the well, we've got academics, and academics they're quite unusual employees compared to the rest of the population, but there's actually a bigger proportion in the sample who are general and professional staff of universities, and they're actually similar to many other white-collar employees in many other industries. They're doing similar sorts of work. So what we'll see is there's some quite big differences between academics and the general and professional staff. And if you're an academic watching this, you'll be interested in what the academics have to say. And if you're not, then probably the general professional staff is close to what the population at large is thinking. And most of the charts here, basically for reasons of cell size, we're focusing on the continuing staff, or at least those who are not employed on casual contracts. So they've got a defined number of hours per week and like a contract that lasts for a year or 2 years or whatever, amongst the general staff and amongst the academic staff. So that's what most of the charts are about. So first up, how did people find the experience of working from home under COVID-19? Well, we asked, this is one of the more innovative parts of the survey. It's one of the issues you have in doing this sort of research is if you do quantitative research, then you're forcing people to choose between certain options. If you're doing qualitative research, then people give you much better answers, but only a minority of people do that. So we tried to combine it through a method that's been used, well, in Germany. Those of you who were at a seminar given here by Werner Nienhuser a few years ago would have seen he used this for looking at employee participation, and we built on that. We asked people, well, we're going to list the first 3 words or phrases that come to mind when you think of your working arrangements under the pandemic. And then we say, what's the first word that comes to mind? And do you consider that first word's positive or negative or neutral? And then we do the same sort of thing for the second or third word. So what we find basically on the left-hand side of the screen, we've got male academics and female academics. And the green bar is the positive responses, basically saying, yeah, that first word, that's got a positive meaning. And those saying it's got a negative meaning are in the black hash bit. And you can see the academics are pretty negative overall. A bit over 30% gave a positive response, a bit under 50% gave a negative response. Very different for the general and professional staff. Well over half gave a positive response to that, and a little bit over a quarter gave a negative response to that. Not big differences between male and female there. We also looked on the left-hand side of this one. It's the same question, but we're comparing Canadians and Australians. So on the left-hand side, again, it's the academics, but you'll see the Canadians are a lot more negative than the Australians were amongst the academics and also amongst the general and professional staff. The pattern here doesn't really vary much between the first response and the second response. So here's their response to the second word. Again, amongst the academics, more negatives than positive. Amongst the Canadians, more negative than amongst the Australians. And likewise, it's fairly similar for the third. So academics more negative, general professional staff more positive. That's pretty consistent pattern. We see that sort of difference in quite a number of the survey questions. So we also wanted to know about practices and preferences for working from home. So we asked people, to what extent do you work from home before and during the pandemic, and overall, what would be your preferred arrangement? So this is what people were doing before the pandemic hit. Again, the academics on the left split into Australians and Canadians, general and professional staff on the right. And what you'll see is that, well, amongst the general and professional staff, the majority of them said they never worked from home. They gave a 0 on that 0 to 10 score that I showed you earlier. The academics, not so many of them said they never worked from home, but the biggest number of them said the minority of the time they spent work from home. So that's typically like a 1 or a 2 response on that 11-point scale. very few people said they always work from home. During the pandemic, of course, things totally changed. Amongst both academics and general and professional staff, the vast majority of people said they always were working from home during the COVID-19 pandemic. But what would be interesting would be, well, what would you rather be doing? And here we found quite a diversity of responses. Generally speaking, the most common response on that 11-point scale from 0 to 10 was a 5, the midpoint, 50-50. And overall, about a third of Australians, a bit less than that of Canadians, were saying, I want to work 50-50, work from the office and work from home. A bit under that, we're saying I'd like to work a majority of my time from home. A bit under that, we're saying I'd like to work a minority of my time from home, but still some of the time. And what really strikes you about this is there's very few people who say, I never want to work from home. And there's not very many people either who say, I always want to be working from home. Most people are saying, I want to be working from home for some of the time, but not for all of the time. But even amongst that some of the time bit, there's quite a variation between those who are saying, I want to work half and half, more at home, more at work, and so on. It varies a bit between countries. The Canadians are actually more dispersed than the Australians. The Australians have a slightly bigger central tendency towards 50-50. There's not a huge difference between the general and professional staff on the one hand and the academics on the other, even though the academics had a lot more prior experience of working from home. And there's not a huge difference between men and women. There's a slightly greater tendency for women to be wanting to work more time from home than men, but it's not a massive difference. There's a slightly greater tendency. So what were some of the positives that people saw? Well, one that is sort of so self-evident it barely didn't warrant asking about, and one that came up quite a bit in the comments was about travel time. And it varies where you are, but generally speaking, getting to uni and back again is a bit of a drag, and if you can avoid doing that, it's a good thing. We did ask some people, okay, which of the following things increased or decreased or remained the same as a result of the changes associated with moving from pre-COVID to COVID working arrangement? And this also picked up some of the positives, the extent to which your working time was disrupted by other people as a result of the changes from working under COVID-19 arrangements. Well, generally speaking, particularly amongst the general and professional staff, they're saying, yeah, I'm interrupted less by other people. That wasn't so much the case amongst the academics. The academics were split pretty evenly between those who said they were interrupted less and those who were interrupted more. And then there's about a fifth of each group that's saying, hasn't changed much. And we asked some questions on the extent to which they agreed or disagreed with various statements. And a majority, quite a decent majority in all groups said, and this I suppose surprised a bit, I've got a separate space at home where I can do university work. And you also had a proportion saying, I've got good equipment at home. They weren't quite so keen on the support provided by universities. The academics were split on that, and in Canada, only about 2/5 of academics were happy with the support provided by the university, and an almost similar amount were unhappy with it. Amongst the general and professional staff, a great majority of them in both countries, but especially in Australia, thought that the university was providing adequate support to enable them to work at home. Having said that, there's a majority saying it, but not everybody was happy. And I should say that we did get quite a few comments in the open-ended responses, people complaining about the lack of support that they were receiving. So most people were happy, but when people were unhappy, they were not reticent in telling us they were unhappy about it. And the other thing is that, you know, people generally thought the physical environment at and around my home is pretty pleasant. Most people say that. It makes sense because that's where you're most likely to move to. You've got a lot more choice in that than you've got in as to where you work. Well, what were some negatives out of it? The majority of people were working more hours. Academics particularly reported this. Around about 2/3 of academics, slightly more amongst females, said that they were spending more time working. But that was also the case for a majority of the general and professional staff as well. And there's only about 1 in 6 of any of these groups that said that I'm working fewer hours. And I think really that the evidence, the anecdotal evidence and the stuff that's come up from other surveys, like the ACTU survey that Jeff Derrick, who's here, had a big role in, that has also showed that basically managers are reporting that productivity is going along pretty well, and that's consistent with what we're finding out so far. So, and the number of hours increased more amongst Australian academics than amongst Canadian academics, and increased more amongst Australian general and professional staff than amongst Canadian general and professional staff. Perhaps because of working longer hours, people were more likely to say, yeah, I'm feeling more tired. So 62% of male and 68% of female academics across the two countries said that they were more tired. Amongst general and professional staff, it's a plurality, but not a majority who's saying, I'm more tired. And that's happening a bit more in Canada than in Australia, but not a huge amount more. We had some questions specifically about academic work. And you'll recall that I said that the academics are generally more negative about this than general professional staff. And one thing that certainly drove the academics' experience was online teaching. Whereas for general and professional staff, fundamentally their mode of production didn't change. They were still doing similar sorts of things on computers. They were interacting with people online rather than face-to-face. But the core of their work wasn't fundamentally different. For academics, for a lot of them it really was, because they had to shift from teaching groups in classrooms to teaching online, which is a really different experience. And the more that people had experience with that, the more they could cope with the new work arrangements. So for those academics who said I had no experience at all in online teaching, fully 3/5 of them described the working from home experience in negative terms, and only 1/5 said that it was positive or gave that first response positive. Similar pattern across the other words. And that proportion, saying it's needed, gradually goes down up to the point where those who said they're very experienced in online teaching were split pretty evenly between those who saw it as a positive and those who saw it as a negative experience. But there's obviously more going on than just that, because even amongst that group who've got very positive experience, there's still nearly half of them who get very experienced in online teaching. There's, even amongst those who are very experienced in online teaching, there's approaching half of them who still saw this as a negative experience overall. People did report pretty uniformly amongst the academics that they spent more time on teaching. And that was occurring a little bit more amongst females than amongst males. Didn't differ a great deal between Canada and Australia. And you had around about half saying they spent less time on research, more time on teaching, less time on research. About half saying less time on research, about a quarter saying they spent more time on research. Again, the gender differences there are pretty small. Time spent on admin and service goes up for academics in both countries, in both genders, but it goes up particularly amongst Australian female academics. Well, we dug down a bit more into what was going on with the research. People's ability to do field work or lab work, collect data basically, that went down pretty uniformly. It went down in both countries by very large amounts, or I should say very large proportions of people said it went down. In Australia, it happened a bit more for women than for men. In Canada, there wasn't that gender difference evident. We asked people about their access to grants, and that also went down. But again, the gender differences weren't all that big. They were a bit bigger there. But the bigger difference, which was really the one that, you know, was evident in that tweet that started the whole thing off, was to start or to finish or submit research papers, sorry. And yes, definitely far more people saying that our ability had gone down than saying it had gone up. And yeah, quite significant gender differences there. 9 percentage points in Australia, probably closer to 10 actually. And similar, a bit closer to 11 in Canada. So, and that is sort of reflected in that tweet that I saw earlier, as I said. Reflecting also that concern that motivated the project in the first place, amongst the academics, about half of them are agreeing, I'm concerned about how performance appraisal will be managed. And only about a quarter of them are disagreeing with that statement. Now, that's amongst the academics. Amongst the general professional staff, no, they've got quite a different view. They're pretty much split, and indeed amongst the females, they're more likely to disagree than to agree that they're concerned about how performance appraisal will be managed. So the issue of performance appraisal is particularly noteworthy for the academics. One of the negatives that did come out, though, was about people's connections with colleagues. And across the board, but oddly, maybe not so oddly, but particularly amongst academics, big majority saying that my connections with colleagues have gone down. And you might think that, well, academics spend a lot of their time working from home. So anyway, well, a minority of their time, even before all this, so why is it such a bigger difference for them? But I suspect that, and this is something that we'll have to find out a bit more through the qualitative data, that the process by which general and professional staff are maintaining contact with each other through the formalised, have a meeting with somebody or talk to somebody via Zoom or Teams or whatever it is, that was maintained a lot more easily than for academics, where it's seems to be a much more ad hoc process, walking inside somebody's room, seeing them in the corridor or whatever. Work-life interference, how did that go? Well, we asked people how much work interferes with your personal life, and there were more people in all groups saying that it had gone up than saying it had gone down, which kind of makes sense because you're bringing work into your personal life. And that was particularly the case for the academics, even though, as I said, they had spent some of their time working from home before. But a majority of them said that the extent to which work interfered with their personal life had increased, whereas only a plurality amongst the general and professional staff. And a little bit more, particularly amongst the academics, amongst women than men. The other way around, how much does personal life interfere with your work? Well, we also had quite a few saying that had increased, not quite as many, a plurality rather than majority amongst the academics, and a plurality but a smaller one amongst the general and professional staff. But very few, as you'd expect, saying it had decreased. To what extent was your working time disrupted by other work responsibilities? And people reported that increasing. It was especially the case for academics. Not huge gender differences there amongst the academics, maybe slightly more amongst women than men, but no notable gender differences there amongst the general and professional staff. And the time spent on domestic responsibilities, which included childcare. Now, looking at the overall size of the charts, agree, disagree, that yes, it does look like time spent on domestic responsibilities increased by pretty similar amounts for men and for women, more for academics than for general and professional staff. And I must say, I was a little bit surprised by that. I thought there'd be bigger gender differences there. But when you look down, interrogate the data a bit more, part of that comes from amalgamating the strongly agree and the somewhat agree responses into a single category to make it easier for analytical and presentational purposes. But for the women academics, 26% said, yeah, the time spent on domestic responsibilities has gone up a lot, whereas that was only the case for 19% of the male academics. And there were some gender differences there also amongst the general professional staff, but they weren't as big. The bigger differences really were in amongst the academics. In terms of what they expected the impact of this would be on their career prospects, well, the academics, there weren't that many who thought, yeah, this has improved my career prospects. There are a lot who thought they'd gone down. Now, this is data for Australia, and I've just done this for Australia because there are a lot more redundancies in Australia than there were in Canada, and that's going to shape the data on this question and on the job security question that I'll show you later. But certainly pretty big pluralities of the academics, and more so amongst female academics, feeling that their career prospects have gone down in Australia. Job satisfaction gone down more for academics. In fact, a majority of academics saying that job satisfaction's gone down. And that is a very different pattern to what you see amongst the general professional staff. And the general professional staff, well, it's pretty evenly split. In fact, if anything, there's more saying where job satisfaction's gone up than gone down. Now, and that's, you see that pattern across the countries, but you do see job satisfaction went down by more in Canada, at least more Canadians reported it going down and few reported it going up, both amongst the academics and amongst the general and professional staff too. So, as I said, I think that move to online teaching is a big part of why the satisfaction for academics has gone down, why they reported it a much more negative experience than did the general and professional staff. I say when I've presented this data or an earlier version of it to some university managers, they basically said, oh yeah, but academics, they complain anyway. They'll just whinge about, no matter what it is, they'll whinge more. So it's not really much of a useful difference there. You know, they're just grumpy. Well, fortunately, we had a way of testing this hypothesis because a few years ago, some of us, including Glenda and Carolyn and a couple of others, had done a study of academics in Australia. And so we're able to compare the changes in job satisfaction. We actually asked the same question, you know, to what extent has your job satisfaction gone up or gone down? And on the left-hand side of this chart, you can see the earlier study in 2011-2012. We call it the Work and Careers in Australian Universities, the WACCOW survey. And in 2020 on the right-hand side, the COVID homeworking in university staff survey, or CHUS as we call it. And what you see is that in 2011-2012, we had about 3 percentage points more academics saying their job satisfaction went down. That's 34 versus 31. And about 4% fewer saying it went up. That's 18 versus 22. Go to the more recent survey, and you'll see that there's a 14 percentage point difference, 49 against 35, in the number of academics who say their job satisfaction's gone down. And there's a 9 percentage point difference between the academics and general staff, 18 against 27, and the proportion who say their job satisfaction's gone up. So, yeah, there is a bit of a difference between general professional staff on the one hand and academics on the other. That goes back to 2011-12, and maybe that just reflects even that difference might reflect the different changes in university systems that were going on at the time. But even if it did reflect underlying grumpiness amongst academics, well, the academics are a lot grumpier now. And that, again, probably reflects, in large part, the shift to a different mode of production. We also asked about the stress that people were experiencing, and the majority of staff, and particularly the majority of academics, reported that their stress had gone up. 3/4, 4/5 of academics saying their stress has gone up, and a bit over half of general and professional staff also reporting their stress has gone up. So that's something, even amongst the general professional staff, a figure that high is something to be a bit concerned about. And of course, this is the job security question that I mentioned earlier. The Australians reporting a much bigger decline in job security than the Canadians, and the academics reporting in either country, well, the academics in Australia reporting a bigger decline in job security than the general professional staff in Australia. Not such a big difference, and indeed in the opposite direction in Canada in terms of job security. So that's a fairly complex pattern there. So, and happy. Australians and the Canadian academics in particular reporting their happiness, how happy you felt has gone down. Amongst the general professional staff, it's fairly similar to the job satisfaction question, much more split views on whether their happiness has gone up or down. So what do we conclude? Well, it's not a simple story. There's a diversity of preferences that people have for working from home, but very few people want to do none of it, and very few people want to do all of their work from home. Most people want to work more from home than they did before, but exactly how much more varies hugely. Overall, in terms of the changes going on in universities that are associated with the working from home arrangements, well, academics are quite a bit more troubled than the general and professional staff. You see that in the data about the word associations and the responses to how happy they are, how stressed they are, what they see as their job prospects, these changes in job satisfaction side. But we can't say that's due to just academics being grumpy, because clearly there's a lot more to it than that, and that doesn't account for the majority of it. People did work more. People were working more hours at home than they were in the office. And the results really do have some significant implications for careers and performance appraisal. And those implications and the general patterns we see, they're gendered. And you see that particularly in terms of people's ability to complete research, to complete research, to submit articles and so on. We're seeing some significant gendered patterns there. Now, some of the problems we've seen weren't just because of homeworking. Like, some of them were associated with online teaching and the shift to online teaching associated with homeworking. Overall, I'd say working from home is really quite complex. In fact, it's probably too complex for simple managerial edicts that managers' solutions to the issues may end up being worse than problems if they don't involve employees and representatives in decisions, because as we can see, employee preferences here are quite complex and don't lend themselves just to management saying, well, hey, from now on, you're going to do X. And the COVID-19 crisis, well, it's going to transform work and how it's done, not just in universities. This pattern of people being actually liking working from home quite a bit, that's something you see in other work. You see it, for example, like I said, in the ACTU survey. You've seen it in other studies and in a lot of the anecdotal stuff that you read about. And so there's going to be some pretty major changes, and they're not just going to be changes that are restricted to universities. And so looking particularly at what's happening with the general professional staff tells us something about how to read what's going on with the rest of the white-collar population. And so if managers think they unilaterally know how and what to do, well, they could end up turning disorder into chaos. And finally, where to next with this project? Well, there's a summary of what I've just been saying with all of these slides that will be available on the WOW website. Chantal's going to put it up straight after this seminar, or almost straight after, see what Chantal says. I should say that there's quite a few slides. Numbers in the slides that are in that document vary very slightly from the numbers that are in here, because the numbers that I used to put together that document were based on a sample of just over 11,000. Yesterday, I got hold of a data set, the final data set that's got an extra couple of hundred observations in it, and that's what the numbers here are about. When I say the numbers are different, like a typical slide, I'll just randomly select one. So here we've got, well, this is more than, I'll go to a different one. So this one's got like 12 figures on it. And on some of the slides, one of those 12 figures might differ by 1 percentage point. So it's very, very close to the final numbers here, but not always identical. So that's but you'll be able to get that from the WOW website. We'll be doing more analysis of the quantitative and the qualitative data, including the word association, the open-ended questions, and Carolyn and Glenda have been working very hard on that, and they're both part of the audience here. And indeed, if there's questions about the open-ended, they might want to answer them. With the large team that you saw me list at the beginning there, we're working on some academic articles. First up will be an article for the Berkeley Journal Industrial Relations, which we have to finish by the end of January. And we're looking for luck with that one. And that will focus on the general patterns of conflict and so on, and working from home and how that has panned out in the university sector. We're looking at a more gender-focused article for a journal like Work and Occupations. We're looking at something for a higher education journal for the more qualitative data, or what are the factors that influence people's preferences for working from home. So there'll be those large team articles, and then there'll be some individual small team projects and articles coming out. And well, I'm hoping that out of all this, we'll be able to see the policy implications, or feed into at least thinking about the policy implications by government, by unions, by employers, by the Fair Work Commission, and so on. But we'll see how that all pans out. And basically, that's it for me. So I'll hand back.
That was fabulous, Dave.